Kia ora. Sorry I can't be there this afternoon, but this is my sensory modulation presentation. I hope you have enjoyed your afternoon so far. So sensory modulation is linked to sensory processing disorder. And the research tells us that if a child has had a severe trauma by the time they're 1 year old, then 100% of those children will develop a sensory modulation or a sensory processing disorder. Likewise, if a child has sexual abuse, then they will also suffer with a sensory processing disorder. So when you consider the amount of kids in our classrooms that have had some sort of trauma in their early lives, it is quite prevalent. So there are 8 sensory systems. There are some near or proximal sensory systems, which tells us about what's going on in our own body. So there's the vestibular, which is where we are in gravity, the proprioceptive, which is where our body parts are in relation to each other body part, and the interoceptive, which is your internal sensations, like hot or cold, or pain. Hunger is another one as well. Whoops. Our far or distal sensory systems tells us what's going on in the world around us. So these you're probably more familiar with: the visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, and your tactile systems. So I'm not going to go into the primitive reflexes too much today, but just to say that sensory processing disorders and primitive reflexes are very much entwined. They exist in a comorbid relationship. So if a child has retained their primitive reflexes, then they will also have a sensory processing disorder, and likewise if they have a processing sensory disorder, they will have a retained primitive reflex as well. So that's a whole, primitive reflexes is a whole other area for another presentation, but if you're interested in that, then there is a lot of resource out there, and the Smart Moves kit is particularly useful for helping primitive reflexes. So sensory modulation, typically it is the modularity process involving the adjustment of neural messages that convey information about intensity, frequency, duration, complexity, and novelty of sensory stimuli. So in plain terms, it is how the brain processes the environment around us, the different sensory inputs from the environment, how our brain copes with that, and how it interprets that. So with this person who isn't sensory modulating or who has a processing disorder, that modulation is slightly different. So this graph shows you the sensory emotional connection. So you can see on one side there's a sensory input, then the neurochemicals and emotions come out at the end. So this is a feedback system, so it feeds forward and it feeds back. So intervening at any of these 3 areas will change the others. So for a child or an adult who is not processing sensory information correctly, the sensory input comes in, the neurochemicals get the signal that there's danger. So that flicks the anxiety button on in the brain. The neurochemicals then kick in, which heightens that anxiety, and so the emotion at the other end is anxiety, and then you get the behaviour. So the behaviour typically in a classroom can be work avoidance, can be going under desks, it can be being very active, fidgety, sort of like an ADHD type behaviour. For instance, if you changed the neurochemical, so if you perhaps were on medication, then the sensory input wouldn't need to be adjusted as much, and your emotion would be a happy emotion. If you change the sensory input, for instance, you went for a walk, so that was feeding your proprioceptive and your vestibular senses, then that would also change your neurochemicals to more of the feel-good neurochemicals, and that would then affect your emotional state, that you'll be happier. So any one of those can be changed and it will affect the others. So this is just a little quote from Spider-Man. When Peter Parker tingles in the face of danger, it's called a spidey sense. But when I do it, it's called generalized anxiety disorder. Okay, so the well-modulated person is able to notice relevant stimuli and filter out unimportant stimuli. They're able to reflect appropriate emotional and behavior responses to situations rather than to the environment. So this tells us if the situation or the environment is something that should have a positive reaction for the child, a positive behavior outcome, then if their behavior response doesn't reflect that, then it is probably a type of sensory disorder. So for instance, if a child's at a birthday party, the environment of a birthday party, it should be fun. It should be a happy thing. The child should be relaxed and having fun. So the environment there, it's not a problem. But if the child's behaviour is one of anxiety or playing out or acting out in the behaviour way, then it's more likely to be a sensory issue rather than a behavioural issue. So modulation disorders, they come in the over-responsive or the under-responsive. So the over-responsive kids or adults, these are the ones that sensory input into their system is really overwhelming. So they tend to try and avoid. So these are the kids that really don't like assemblies. They don't like kapa haka, too loud, too noisy. They may not like sitting near a window because it's too bright. Fluorescent lights. These are the ones that, if there's a crowd, lots and lots of kids in a group, that they will want to be at the back of the mat or away from the line of kids. They could be the fussy or the picky eaters. They don't like certain textures or tastes. So they will avoid a lot of that sensory stuff. The under-responsive kids, these are split into two. So you have your sensory-seeking children. These are the ones that are very active, and they will seek more and more and more input. So these are the ones that tiptoe walkers, because that puts a lot of the pressure on the ball of the foot, gives them a lot more sensory feedback. They will be the kids that have to fidget and fiddle, the pen clickers, the ones that are always up and down out of their desks, walking around the classroom, the ones that won't stay in the classroom, that leave, or are hard to get back into the classroom after a playtime. They want to stay on the play equipment. These often kids that are banging and crashing into others or into furniture, into walls, because that feeds their proprioceptive feedback systems. It also is the kids that like to hide between furniture or in tight spaces. The hoodies up over their heads. Sometimes that can be Sorry, had a bit of a technical hitch there. Tight clothing, ones that like that feeling of pressure on their skin. So the other one is the passive under-responsive. So these are the kids that are quite lethargic. They tend to be gamers, sit on the couch all day long, not very active, but they are still needing sensory or alerting type of activities. So on this graph, you can see this is a response threshold curve. If you imagine that the vertical axis is the stimulation from the environment, so different sensory experiences fed into the students. So you can see the typical child in yellow needs an average amount of stimulation or an average amount of sensory input to get to the optimum learning threshold. So the top of that curve is where they're in the sweet spot for learning. So they've just got enough alertness to learn, but not too much that they're overstimulated. With under-responsive kids in the green, you can see they need a lot more. They need a lot more sensory input to reach that threshold ready for learning. But you can also see that the over-responsive kids in the red, it doesn't take a lot of that sensory input for them to reach overload. So their threshold is very, very low. Anything like a loud noise or bright lights or too busy classroom, even visually busy classroom can take them to a place where they're not in their optimal learning limit. So the over-responsiveness of the protective responses of the nervous system. So remember the protective responses, it's that red flag, danger, anxiety. So these guys are the avoiders. So their behaviours will attempt to calm their nervous systems. So they'll need calming activities. So like I say, these kids are the ones that avoid loud noises, avoid kapahaka, avoid assembly, depending on what their sensory disorder is, because you can have 1, 2, they're multiple. So those are the over-responders are the avoiders. The passive under-responser, so the underactive response of the nervous system to incoming stimuli. So they may be passive and oblivious to stimuli. So these are the kids that, they can really hurt themselves and it just doesn't register. I know a boy who broke his leg in 3 places, and it wasn't until that night his parents realised he hadn't been walking around like he normally does, and took him to the hospital. And he hadn't complained once of being in pain or being in any discomfort. So these would be your passive under-responders. They tend to be overweight because they don't move around a lot. They are needers, so they need the sensory input, but they're helpless to know how to get that for themselves. But they do need alerting and stimulating activities. And then you have the sensory craver. So these are under-responsive, but they seek more input to reach that sensory threshold. So they're the ones that are constantly in motion, constantly thrill-seeking, constantly moving, clicking, fidgeting. They are needers, so their behaviours attempt to reach that high threshold. Remember on the graph, they're the green ones that have quite a high threshold to get that sensory input into their nervous system. So counterintuitively, these kids actually need more alerting and more stimulating activities rather than less. They don't need calming down, they need more of the same of what they're seeking. But then within that, there needs to be some guidelines to make it effective and safe, and that they don't get overstimulated. So this is a sensory emotional continuum. So on one end, you've got your over-responders, which in behaviour terms, you will see anxiousness, stress, frustration, and they can become very angry. On the other end, you've got your under-responders. And these kids, if they're sensory seeking, can be your hyper, giddy, manic, ADHD type behaviours. Your under-responsive passives will be content, melancholy, and unmotivated. And they're often the ones that are trickier to see and trickier to spot. But they're the ones, once again, if you remember back to the behaviour and environment, if they're in an environment that they should be responding to behaviourally in a favourable stimulator way and they're still not, then it's most likely to be a sensory passive under-responsive. Okay, so I'm going to get the team to hand you an assessment tool. This is a really, really handy checklist that you fill in with the parents, and it will help to identify